All right, kiddos. So let's talk a little bit about World War One and more specifically the background information for All Quiet on the Western Front. So World War One spans from about 1914 to 1918. Started July 28th, 1914, between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. So I'm sure you guys learned about this a little bit already, but basically it was because Serbia was wanted their independence from Austria-Hungary. Sorry about that. Serbia wanted their independence from Austria-Hungary, and there was a Serbian kind of liberation movement called the Black Hand, who orchestrated the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the leader of Hungary at the time. This assassination brought this kind of cascading effect where basically all these countries had sworn allegiances either to Austria-Hungary or to each other or to Serbia or to countries that were allied with Serbia. And basically it became this web that drew in 32 other nations, or 32 nations total. Even though what should have been probably a relatively small issue between two countries then ends up being this global war that kills millions upon millions of people. Definitely the biggest death count we had at the time. Now, World War II is going to come along and blow that death count out of the water very quickly. But at the time, it was, very different. So on the Allied power side, so the side that the United States fought on, we have Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and the US, as well as a whole bunch of other smaller countries as well. These were just kind of the major powers. On the other side, the central powers, we have Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria. And again, there were lots of other ones in that one as well. It was called the Great War, the war to end all wars. That ended up being very far from true. In 1939, World War II is going to come along. And obviously, we've had other wars even past that one. But at the time, people just kind of saw that there was no way we could have killed any more people. We couldn't have gone any further. So we lost 11 million soldiers in World War I and 7 million civilians. Now, part of this is due to disease. Like you can see down here, 2 million died from disease. So part of it was the fact that, our medicine just wasn't advanced. But the other part, the reason why, again, we had that many millions of deaths was because we're seeing huge advancements in warfare at the time, right? We're starting to see the application of bombardment, of bombings that are getting much more accurate. They're getting much more sophisticated. They're getting much more deadly. We're starting to see the advent of gas and chemical warfare. We're starting to see the use of tanks for the first time. All of this led to a much higher death count than any war we'd seen previously. Also, the use of trench warfare. We have machine guns, automatic weaponry, all that kind of stuff. And trench warfare didn't help either, because trench warfare was, deeply problematic because it was a war of attrition, and it was a war of attrition over a very small piece of land that just kind of made it all the more kind of horrifying. And when we're reading All Quiet on the Western Front, we'll see how they kind of just go back and forth over these tiny little pieces of land and the kind of toll that takes on the men, the mental toll. 20 million people were wounded in World War I. So the other thing was that even if you survived the war, it wasn't like you survived unscathed. Most of them were physically disfigured. They lost limbs, or their faces or bodies were disfigured due to shrapnel or to burns or from chemical issues. And even those that looked unscathed, those that didn't look like they had anything wrong with them, had terrible, terrible PTSD. They called it shell shock, but we know it now to be definitely PTSD. And that's what really happened with this man, Eric Maria Remarque. So he's our author of All Quiet on the Western Front, which is the novel that we're going to be starting at the end of this week. He was born in Germany in 1989. So, like I said, he was born in Germany in 1898, and at 18 years old, he joined the German army, which was very standard. And Paul, our main character, Paul Balmer, in the novel, he's also our narrator, joins at 17 or 18 years old. So there was a lot of patriotism, a lot of guys kind of being pressured into joining right after they kind of were old enough, right? Right when they're at the end of high school. It's possible he was drafted, but we're not sure. We know the characters are largely volunteers. And since this is semi-autobiographical, it's definitely not an autobiography because it's a fictional novel, but a lot of the stuff that occurs is very similar to probably things that happened to him while he was fighting on the Western Front. He was sent to the Western Front, so that's the fighting that was happening between Germany and France largely, but the British and the Americans were also fighting on that front during this time. And he saw firsthand kind of how horrible the war was and what these soldiers were going through. He was wounded 5 times. Each time, the four times he was sent back to the front, which was very normal. Germany was kind of running out of people by the end of World War One. And they kept sending wounded soldiers back to the front, back to the front, back to the front. The last one was life-threatening, and he was actually sent home and ended up finishing out the war there. But even after the war, he didn't really feel like he survived. He was alone. He was lost. He couldn't hold down a job. Again, all of these are symptoms of depression and things that we associate with PTSD. He was a teacher for a little while. He tried to own his own business. He tried to be a drama critic. He just struggled with all of these things. And about 10 years after his experiences in World War One, he published All Quiet on the Western Front in 1929. And basically it focuses on a generation of men and boys, really, at 18 years old, who were destroyed by this war. And he thought that was something that was being ignored largely by the mass public, and it was something that he wanted to draw attention to. So in 1938, Germany renounces his citizenship. Now, this timing is very interesting because 1939 is the start of World War II. So Germany is gearing itself up for a war effort, and they don't want someone like Erich Maria Remarque reminding people of the toll of war and the just kind of horrible tax that it kind of puts on young bodies. So in the 1930s, the Nazis were burning his book. They claimed he wasn't a patriot and that he didn't love Germany, when in reality, he was just telling the truth. He was being honest. He moved to Switzerland after his citizenship was renounced, and he ended up becoming an American citizen in 1947, and to my knowledge, never returned to Germany. Yeah, so that's kind of the legacy of his novel. So these are a couple of topics that we're going to be dealing with throughout this novel that we're going to kind of see come up over and over and over again. So one is the destruction of nature. World War I, because of all the ordnance and the trenches and things like that, was something that actually had a huge impact on nature and on the surrounding countryside and things like that. In France, you can still see the scars left by trenches, by exploded bombs. And that's not even just counting the unexploded ordnance that still exists in a lot of these countries. So that's something that we'll be kind of looking at as we're reading the novel. The second one is nature's indifference to man's destruction. So that's kind of the other side of the coin, which is that nature seems to kind of find a way, if I can quote Jurassic Park to you guys. There's this idea that that the world kind of keeps spinning regardless of what people do, and regardless of the fact that, there are men killing and dying and hurting each other down below, birds are still migrating and stuff like that. Oneness of man or unity among soldiers. This is the idea that all soldiers, regardless of what country they're fighting for, are experiencing similar things, be that the difficulties of being in war, the horrors of watching your friends die, the toll that killing another human being takes on you, all of those things are part of that idea of oneness of man. Comradeship is the feeling of unity that soldiers feel with their own soldiers. So Paul's relationship with his friends in his company, it would be an example of comradeship. Dehumanization is the idea that soldiers have to dehumanize the enemy in order to kill them, but also themselves. I've talked about this before, and I'll talk about it more when we get into night, if we get to night. But we are social animals, right? We need people, and killing is not something that comes very naturally to us. So we have to dehumanize the enemy. We have to make them into animals in an effort to convince ourselves that they aren't human, and that kind of allows us to kill people and lets us know that it's not really real. But you also have to dehumanize yourselves, right? You have to take away a little bit of your humanity in order to be able to do that. And Paul talks about that a fair amount in the novel. Condemnation of warfare is very simply war is bad. It does terrible things to people. It exacts a terrible toll on both the military and the civilian population. And that's something that Remarque looks at unflinchingly throughout this entire novel. And then last is loss of innocence, generational responsibility. And this is basically just the idea that these boys had to grow up very, very fast. They went into war thinking that it was going to be wonderful and an adventure and just, incredible. And that it would make them men and it would make them brave and courageous and strong. And instead, it ripped their childhood away from them. It showed them that, humans are capable of extraordinary evil. And they had to watch their friends die. They had to put themselves in danger and fear for their own lives, all because their countries told them to, because the people that they trusted, their teachers, their elders, sometimes their parents, told them that war would be different from what they actually experienced. So there's this huge divide between what Paul and his friends are experiencing and what people said that he would experience. And so Paul loses a lot of trust in those authority figures, right? Because we trusted them to keep us safe, and we didn't. That was a huge failing, and in a big part of the generation in Germany was just not adequately preparing them for what they were going to experience. Okay, I look forward to reading All Quiet on the Western Front with you guys very soon. Talk to you guys later.